like to welcome you all to the last panel discussion of this conference, and I would like the ones who have not yet taken their seats to please do so, because some people have to run to the airport or the railway station at the end of this session. We'll extend it for 10 minutes, so we'll end at 5. My name is Detlef Müller-Mahn. I'm Professor of Development Geography here at the University of Bonn, and until recently I was in Bayreuth as a member of the African Studies Center in Bayreuth, so that is what somehow gives me a close relationship with area studies and with Bonn. I would like to begin with introducing the panelists, and then I take the freedom to say some introductory remarks. So I'll begin with, on the left side, that is Matthias Middell, Professor of Cultural History at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Philosophy in Leipzig, and he's the spokesperson of the Center for Area Studies in Leipzig. So that is Area Studies summarized in the title of your website. Then the second person is Vincent Houben. No, sorry. You're the third person. Second person. Olaf Kaltmeier, Junior Professor of Transnational History of the Americas and Director of the Center of Inter-American Studies at the University of Bielefeld. Vincent Houben, Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at Humboldt University. And one of the questions I find interesting on your website is how area studies can be made more relevant for the future. I think that is something we all would like to know. We discussed it in the past 2 days. Then Professor Heike Holbig, Professor for Political Science with a focus on Chinese and East Asian area studies at Goethe University, Frankfurt. And then the person sitting next to me, maybe the most important person, because that is where the money is coming from. Sabine Eilers, Head of Division for Humanities, Social and Cultural Sciences, Academies and Research Museums at the Federal Ministry of Higher Education and Research. I think, is that the right current translation of the title of BMBF? And what I found interesting when I Googled your name at the ministry, I mean, people working at universities, there's always lots of publications, etc. When I Googled your name, the first thing to pop up was Bekanntmachung, and the most recent Bekanntmachung is about the establishment of regional research centers, the so-called Forschungskollegs, International Center for Advanced Studies for the Humanities in Southeast Asia. There are also more Bekanntmachung when one Googles your name, so for the people working in other areas of the world. Before I give the word to the panelists, who are each invited to give some 5 to 7 minutes about the questions of this conference, and the key question for all of us should be the so what question. So what have we learned, how are we going on, and what does that mean for the future of the area studies? I would like to remind all of us of the introductory keynote lecture we've had by Peter Jackson. There he is, Peter, and if you allow, I would like to highlight 3 out of the many points you had in your interesting talk. The first one was a compliment that you made in the very beginning of your talk. You said that this BMBF program has at least resulted in a higher visibility of German area studies all over the world, and it has, from your impression from the other side of the world, from Australia, it has greatly improved profile building at German universities. And this is actually, these are 2 of the main targets of the program of BMBF. The second point I would like to highlight is that in the beginning, and that was somehow cutting through your talk, you talked about the juxtaposition of area studies and systematic disciplines. This is one of the themes we've had all over again. But what I find interesting is that in the talks in between during the coffee breaks, I had the impression that for most people who are somehow part of the areas, this is not really a problem, no longer. So this juxtaposition, this dichotomy between area studies and systematic disciplines seems to be something that we are overcoming, or that is outdated in the current debate, and I wondered what that means for what we are discussing here. And then the third point I find most important, and I hope that the panelists will say a few words about that. That was your point about the neoliberalization of the university system and research funding, not only in Germany, but across the world. So what that means is an increasing fierce competition over funds and fundability. And that does also mean for us in the area studies, there is a competition for cooperation with the best partners in the Global South, which make it easier for us to get access to funds here in Germany, for example. I wonder what that means for the way how we structure and organize the area studies. The second point under this headline of neoliberalization is that it leads to some kind of mainstreaming. And area studies, and what we're discussing here, may also be considered as a way of mainstreaming. So there are some new topics popping up. That means that the funds are not getting more, but they are spread over more newly emerging disciplines. So what does that mean for what we're discussing here? And finally, it's about gatekeepers, people, and I'm sure there are also people among us who willingly or not are gatekeepers for things and directions of research that they think are relevant, and what they're doing is that they're keeping others outside. I wonder what that means for the diversity and the freedom of science. So having said that, I hand over to the panelists. Each of you has 5 to 7 minutes to try to refer to the following 4 questions. You all have the questions in your handout. The first question was with respect to conclusions from this program and comments and recommendations we may give to the BMBF. The second question is for the future study programs and the nexus of area studies and systematic disciplines. The third question concerns how epistemological and geographic boundary dissolution of research and teaching may be realized. And the last one, what are the means area studies scholars have to influence the science policy agenda in their interest? So the first speaker, we should begin from the left, Thomas Middell, and then we just go from 1 to 2 minutes. Or you just want to, or you may also stay in the order of the whatever. So the first speaker then will be Heike. That's all right. Okay, just go from one to the other.
So I'm starting. Hello to everybody. The room is still full. I'm happy that everybody is looking forward to the panel discussion in the end. Being the first speaker, I'd like to address particularly the first question. What conclusions can be drawn after 3 years of the BMBF? I call it BMBF, okay, it's easier. Initiative for strengthening and advancing the area studies, and only touch upon the fourth question in the end briefly. I decided to do so because I'm part of 2 of the BMBF funded projects since 2010. And one of them is AFRASO, it was mentioned before, Africa's Asian Options, which... Can you
speak closer to the microphone?
Oh yeah, okay. So one of the project is called Africa's Asian Options, which really by decision moves beyond the stereotype of China's engagement in Africa and instead looks at the multiple interactions between African and Asian countries and the options that derive therefrom. And the flyer has it all. It has the trans-regional component, the interdisciplinary, the interactions, the parastatal, the deterritorialization, translation, transnational, post-terrestrial area studies, and so on. Translocalization, don't forget that one. So it's all in here. And then I'm also part of another project that does quite the opposite. It's one of the competence networks where, in this case, 5 universities and research institutions in Germany are collaborating with a focus on governance in China. Okay, so this is sounds very old-fashioned perhaps. We are collaborating to analyze governance, innovations, adaptations from the local grassroots level. What are the role of local cadres? Environmental protests, other kind of social protests, but up to the national level of where policies are formulated and where machine legitimacy is, well, developing in one or another direction. So We have an inter-university center, on one hand doing this trans-regional big thing of interactions, entanglements, and the other experience is from a competence network looking at a very well-delineated research object in China, one country, and political science, basically. So, and from these two, which I can oversee, I'd like to just formulate a few lessons that, well, I think can be drawn. One explicit goal of the BMBF initiative has been the internationalization of German science and research, and I think Peter Jackson already was a witness to that, saying that I think in this field mission has been accomplished quite well, at least perhaps not vis-a-vis the people from Harvard and Cornell, but we have some here. I feel that on the one hand within the European community of area studies people, there has been now really a profile of these networks very clearly established, and more prominently even I would rank the international visibility in our case Asia, East Asia, where I think we have really not only had a lot of conferences and visiting scholars going back and forth, but there's a lot of publications now being published into Chinese or other languages in East Asia, not only on our initiative, but also by demand. We found our articles being quoted by Chinese scholars, and we are doing the same all the time. So there's a clear increase, as far as I can see, from this initiative into the internationalization of area studies vis-a-vis the regions that we are now doing research with. Right? So this is a very clear positive development. And I'm also very optimistic about the promotion of interdisciplinarity, something that a lot of people see is quite skeptically. But I feel, well, personally I've done it all the way because I've been trained in Chinese studies, but worked at the intersection of political science and economics. So I myself feel as an interdisciplinary person, but through the project I had a lot of opportunities to really work with other people from other disciplines, and I found the most promising format to co-author articles within conceptual frameworks of smaller or larger networks and projects that have been formulated to apply for funds for this funding line. So I think also the interdisciplinarity goal has been really achieved quite well. Some would say that to train young scholars as interdisciplinarists runs the risk of not preparing them well for the academic labor market. But I wonder whether this is really so true. At least I feel a lot of acceptance of my political science, sociology, economics colleagues to really invite people to create new professorships that have area studies in their denomination or whatever, and also kind of permeability toward younger people being trained in area studies. Okay. The point where I'm more uneasy is, let's say, about a third effect that does not really result from the BMBF initiative, but might be more co-produced by that. And this is what I feel is an increasing bias toward trans-regionalism as an end in itself. I think there's a corresponding skepticism that has emerged over the past few years only toward everything that has to do with bounded entities, be it the state, the region, the nation, and other essentialist container concepts, homogenized, nationalized. So we heard this all the time. And the problem that I have with that skepticism toward everything studied is that we really risk an epistemological, not only an analytical, but also epistemological bias toward the trans, cross, inter, and everything, but missing out on the dialectical opposite, which is not the entanglements, but the entrenchments. I have a long list, but I won't read it. So, but we have not only trans-regionality, trans-nationality, trans-locality, trans-culturality, but we also have a strong, and particularly in East Asia. I think strong empirical emphasis on national sovereignty, territorial integrity, regional homogeneity, and so on. And we are not only dissolving borders, but there are a lot of borders being remade, being reified, and so on. It's not all about fluidity, but I think it was in one of the papers, fluid or perpetual. I think it's fluidity versus plasticity. The region doesn't run between our fingers like water. It's more like ceramics or something which has a stickiness, which has an inertia. It's not all that is flowing and fluid and rapid, but I think there's inertia in concepts that are there, horizontally but also vertically, and I think we really have to take these things into account. Just some examples I could bring in. Yeah?
Fluidity, that was a nice word to close.
Okay.
Next speaker is Olaf Kaltmeier.
Yeah, thank you. I also speak on behalf of two projects, actually, in the context of the BMBF initiative, which is the BMBF competence net on Latin America, ethnicity, citizenship, and belonging, where I conduct the Bielefeld part of the competence net, and as a co-director of the BMBF project in the Americas as Space of Entanglement at Bielefeld University. And I would like to speak about the Americas or inter-American hemispheric area studies, because that is what we do in Bielefeld, which is a quite new emerging field of research, interdisciplinary field of research, where we are positioned in, but which we also have shaped in a certain way. It emerged from different perspectives, from American studies, Chicano studies, American studies with the doubt that they speak about America in their name, but only relate actually to the US, and that was questioned by Chicano ethnic literatures. So there is a new debate of what America actually means. There's a debate on economic integration from NAFTA, which was NAFTA, the free trade area of the Americas, to Latin American integration projects such as UNASUR, and obviously there's the experience of migration. So the idea of is to rethink areas in a certain way, not to think in certain national categories or in geocultural blocks, such as the Protestant US American in contrast to Catholic Latin America, but to focus on entanglements, which was the main idea. The main idea is to rethink the Americas in terms of as a space of entanglement, where we choose three heuristic approaches, which is quite similar also, I think, to the approach what we have discussed here. Approach first of transnational flows with transregional mobilization, circulation of peoples, but also of objects, ideas, commodities. So we speak about the spread of neobiota and the colonization processes, of following hurricanes in the Caribbean, to have a different image of mobile concept of space. But we think that we also need other spatial categories, such as geopolitical imaginaries. So thinking of that in terms of articulation of several different spatial fragments into a broader concept of space, what also has been discussed here. And the third aspect, what we want to mention, is the importance of environment in terms of material dimension of space, which we often forget about in our very constructive approaches. So here we deal with processes of green grabbing, land use, and land rights. I don't want to go here into detail, but I think we have discussed a lot about disciplines and the impact of area studies. And I think there's a big methodological impact of area studies in terms of thinking about the constellations we have mentioned, and in taking serious the different locus of enunciation in unequal power relations, so that knowledge is rooted, and the disrootedness produces different knowledge. So thinking here of dialogic methodologies transcultural knowledge, intercultural knowledge, and these elements, I think, is a very new and important approach, methodological approach that comes from area studies. And in this aspect, I also ask myself the question, what is the universal approach of the so-called disciplines? Because we all know with the end of the great narrations declared in postmodern theories, actually when I look at my colleagues in sociology or history, there's a limited range of these universal theories. So I think that area studies in these terms is more kind to the postulations of Baumann, who claimed that probably the ethical value, or the most important ethical value in area in postmodern societies, could be tolerance and understanding of the other. And I think this is what area studies is very much about. We want to this is not only a general reflection, we think that this also leads to the creation of different forms of knowledge. So we have a dictionary project where we don't want to define concepts, terms to fix them, but to show how they are produced from different horizons, how there exists a pluritopic construction of these concepts. So that the same concept can be very much differently used in another conceptual framework or regional framework. In this idea, we want to show that dialogue, speak about difference, acknowledge difference itself is a value in knowledge production. Because if we don't have difference, it's the end of dialogue. We don't have to speak and interchange ideas if we don't have difference. And I think this is a very important approach towards area studies. One last aspect, I think, in positioning towards the disciplines, I see probably two approaches. One could be termed hegemonic approach, and the other approach of affinity. Hegemonic approach would mean that we have to engage in areas, in disciplines, and make our claims towards the knowledge of disciplines. But on the other hand, I think we should also apply a strategy of affinity. That means to search and to create spaces and places of interchange where also area or different knowledge is produced. So I very much like this idea, and I feel that a strong relationship of the discussions we had at this conference to the discussions we had in our conferences on inter-American area studies. And I think it's a very important to think about more spaces like this to come to discussions. A last remark is about transdisciplinarity. We work in our project from literary studies, history, sociology to law and systematic ecology. And I think that there are certain circles of transdisciplinary. So we have an inner circle, so to say, which is more based on an understanding in terms of cultural term, spatial term, where we have an understanding and a similar vocabulary from literary studies, sociology and history. And we have a kind of, where the translation is more difficult, and it has taken us a lot of time to go into the discussion with biology, which comes from a very different, so to say, disciplinary trajectory.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. I won't comment on the state of area studies where we stand now. I think everyone who has been at this conference can see that there is a certain convergence of the ideas, and that the box of the area has been opened up. So if I may put it that brief, I'll stick with that because my time is very limited. I want to make a few other remarks which are more related to scientific policies in Germany. First of all, I'm a bit of an outsider because I came from the Dutch academic system. And what I like about Germany is that, at least in the field of Southeast Asian studies, there's not much of a tradition that goes back very far. So I feel very free, so to speak, to explore the boundaries or go across the borders of my own region, because nobody stops me. And in Holland, definitely, so to speak. The other thing is, I think what is good about this debate that is going on in Germany, and I think it's unique if you compare to other parts of the world as far as I can oversee, is that it is not only part of a survival strategy. It's rather a more fundamental debate on the repositioning of area studies in a knowledge order that is changing, because our context, the universities are in change. And I think to fight the bogeyman, so to speak, is not a very helpful approach, because most Aryanists are disciplinarians at the same time, and they're juggling these things all the time. Now I want to talk a bit about the BMBF initiative. I think it was great. Why was it great? Because I met some of my colleagues, and even I met many Aryanists across self-imposed borders of these areas. So I've never talked much to people working on East Asia or other parts of the world, and this is very enlightening for me. I think the element of networking, even within my own network, which was confined to Southeast Asia, was very good, because normally, because of the decentralized system, you normally don't talk much to colleagues, not regularly, and not on contents. It's more about politics, but not on contents. I think I have to be critical also. I think the tender system is a bit problematic, especially in very small areas, because some lose, some win, and that makes some people angry, and we feel the effects in our community. So that is not a very nice by effect. There's also the idea that it should be sustainable. So how to continue, how to persist. I think it's not entirely fair, because we depend a lot on our universities. And our universities are what they are. They pay lip service to area studies, but the real stakes are elsewhere. And I'd be quite honest, 2017 is the year in which the Excellency Initiative runs out. And at our institute, we have already 2 class professors. We've been marked. We have core professorships and so-called profile professorships. And I have under the strong impression that if additional money is needed for the big natural science projects in our universities, we will be on the mark again. So not yet. We are very happy now, but in 2017 it might be different. And under these circumstances, to demand of us to mobilize our university leaders to invest more in area studies is simply unrealistic. It cannot happen, it will not happen. So what to do about this? Well, one of the responses is to organize area studies. So a good thing is that finally all these small clusters of Aryanists contact each other and they organize. And that's my lead over to Matthias.
Okay. I'm a little bit of a veteran here because our 4 years funding period for the Center for Area Studies in Leipzig expired already in May this year. So we just finished our final report. I stopped all the marketing for Leipzig here and will send everyone this wonderful report. There's only one element I would like to put emphasis on. We qualified over the past 4 years 10 postdocs. 3 of them got professorships outside Germany, 1 inside Germany. This is a success when I read the introductory note here. And on the other hand, one may ask if area studies are now in the situation, history, for example, is already for a long time, simply supplying the world market with private Privatdozenten. This is something we have observed in other fields as well. when it comes to this sustainability thing, we were lucky enough to make it into a paper that our university had to deliver to the ministry on its excellency. We don't know if this is a check or not, but in the end, there is now the demand for more coordination, not only within the university, but also with the nearby University of Halle. So, of course, the ministries have the expectation that coordination means cutting positions, while we try to interpret that demand as an expectation for more, not only research networks, but also networks in teaching, because I guess what is essential when it comes to this sustainability story is to transform the funding for research projects, networks, centers, etc. into something universities have to be interested in and the lender have to be interested in, and that is teaching, and not only research. Trans-regional studies, that leads me back to what was already said about this opposition between area studies or areanists and the disciplines. I have never understood that opposition because at least there is a lack of history in that story. I mean, 3/4 of the representatives of the area studies here at the table are historians, if I'm right. And from a historical point of view, this opposition between the static and the moving, etc., is all nonsense. The question is, why at a certain period some things start to become fluid, and who tries to fix them again? So if you have historicity in that story, I guess all these false oppositions of local and global, etc., are very much in decline. That was, to some extent, in the background of an initiative earlier this year to create an association, a professional organization called CrossArea, in order to influence the organization of the German research organization, BFG, in its next elections. So the idea was to propose at least a new Fachkollegium instead of the one that is sort of picking everything that has to do with exotic things, the 106, and which is very much based on philological and anthropological approaches. The decision by the DFG was a wise compromise to reject completely our proposal, but to offer the association the opportunity to propose candidates for election next year. So that means that in the old structure, there is at least the opportunity to propose candidates who may represent what one may call either trans-regional studies or comparative area studies, global studies and the like, not being completely identical with classical, well-bounded area studies in whatever kind of old style. We will see what will happen during elections and especially what will happen after elections in case candidates are elected, because then we would have the methodological debate that was stimulated by this initiative here within the Fachkollegium and not between those being represented there and the others always claiming if we would be there, our projects would be funded. So that is this idea. Of course, and I'm also a little bit critical towards the initiative, but not in the sense that the ministry could do better. I guess there is a dilemma. What the ministry can do is fund projects for a limited amount of time, 4 years, 6 years or so. And then the question is how to translate that into the often claimed structural sustainability. And as Vincent said already, universities, rectorates, etc., are completely out of their possibilities to answer positively to that if we are not translate what we discuss here at this conference and at many other workshops into new teaching programs that may attract new kinds of students, because some of the area studies are in fact overfunded when we compare it to the number of students they train. So the question is how to legitimate these competences. Everyone here in the room is convinced that they are important. By a new influx of students and new enrollment students. And I guess this is what these networks as well as the centers may eventually allow if we use it for this sort of translation of a research cooperation into larger teaching networks. And then I have a couple of suggestions what we could do, but I guess my 5 minutes are over.
You got 1.5 minutes.
Okay, so then I would start with them at least. First of all, I guess we need a discussion in the area studies associations and organizations, not only at the departmental level, a very critical debate if what they offer right now at universities really fits the needs of the students. If all these study programs are necessary. I mean, my university has 360 professors and 185 study programs. If someone from one of these consultancy companies would come by, he or she would eventually criticize this as not very clearly focused. Second is, are we able to, and this concerns especially area studies. We have these one-man institutes which offer rural programs, and they are in competition with larger institutes having 6, 7, 8 professors and offering programs that are much more in line with what is discussed here as theoretical ambition. So the question is it possible to bring them together into networks, eventually crossing the borders of universities or eventually even of Länder. There are larger ones and smaller ones. You are in a more privileged position. In Leipzig, you take a bike and you cross already the border per region. Then there's the question, do we have something to offer in foreign countries? We just experienced a study program we offered all together with the University of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and there's a lot of demand for knowledge about China, about India, because these are the big investors in that country, and they would like to know a little bit about that, and not so much what we know about Africa and then tell it to Africans. One very important issue I would like to mention is that the German Research Council is changing its policy towards supply of literature. So there is now competition. The people have no longer a guarantee that the so-called Sondersammelgebiete will sustain. And that means we all depend from the success of the application filed in by that university that was 40 years ago the responsible university for, let's say, literature on China, on Africa, on Latin America, etc. And if this university, for whatever reason, fails, then there is 3 years of a gap in the provision of specialized literature. I guess that will lead to an enormous dilemma. We have not yet seen the consequences because we are just entering this period. But I guess this needs initiative across Länder and universities to address that issue. So let me stop here.
Yeah.
So, my turn. I'm sitting here not as a scientist, but as someone funding science you are doing. And I'm mainly here to hear what's your opinion and what's your input on what we are doing. But nevertheless, let me summarize what we have done, what was our aim, and how we see the effects gained up to now. Area studies are an essential part of our research funding. The key organization of our institutional funding is the Max Weber Foundation, with research institutes and activities in 11 countries worldwide. The most prominent activity in the field of project funding is this initiative strengthening and advancing area studies. The funding of area studies is a long-term initiative. It was part of the funding initiative Freedom for Research in the Humanities, published in 2007, and it is essential part of the framework program for the humanities, cultural sciences and social sciences that was published in December 2012. Internationalization is one of the core aims of that program. In this priority area, the BMBF provides support to these disciplines in making their contribution to understanding past and contemporary society in Europe and worldwide. Area studies investigates global interdependencies and processes of exchange, whether cultural, political, economic, social, or legal in nature. Demand for such knowledge is constantly growing, not least in the spheres of politics, culture, ecology, and business, since solutions to many problems currently facing society will need to be found at international level in the future. Under these conditions, research and funding practice are moving towards a highly international orientation. Research no longer works purely in a historical and philological context, but with relevance to the present in a multidisciplinary approach. In that sense, BMBF funding for area studies focuses on strengthening the links between different disciplines. 2008, 2 lines of funding were established to develop competence networks between university and non-university institutions and to set up centers within universities. Some were already mentioned here. 7 networks and 3 university centers have been launched in this first phase, 2009. They exemplify new networking opportunities within universities and access by foreign actors to the German science and research system. Following a second call for proposals, 6 further university centers were added in 2013. All projects have a duration of 4 years. Subject to a positive scientific evaluation, they can be extended by an additional period of up to 2 years. I'm happy to announce that the Crossroads network will start its second period in January 2015 and will be funded until December 16. The second important reason for such funding by us were the recommendations of the German Wissenschaftsrat, German Council of Science and Humanities, on area studies published in 2006. The Council recommended the structural, methodical, theoretical, and conceptual strengthening of area studies in Germany. Our funding measure was a reaction to 2 problems concerning area studies mentioned in the Council's report. In the first place, while area studies in Germany provided a broad spectrum of knowledge about different world regions, cultures, and states, individual disciplines had a strongly historical and philological character. Collaboration with systematic disciplines was said, I don't know, but it was said several times, to be limited to individual cases. The report also stated that area studies had an extremely heterogeneous existence at different institutions. It ranged from individual professorships and seminars to centers and departments, as well as from universities to the non-university sector. Thus, although its expertise clearly existed, it was scattered around. Such a huge fragmentation meant that the available resources were not being used to their full potential. Through the 2 project lines, the competence networks linking different universities and the centers within universities, we are strengthening cooperation between different institutions and disciplines and thus overcoming this fragmentation. At the same time, support is being provided for cooperation with systematic disciplines such as political science, religious studies, ethnology, history, while a new impetus is being given for transregional, subject-specific issues and new fields of application for area studies are being opened up. Policy advice, university teaching, specialist journalism, things like that. The funding initiative is already providing positive results. Most projects have been evaluated and will be extended beyond the initial 4-year term. The collaborations and centers are characterized by interesting and innovative research issues that cover many familiar regions, but also original geographic areas for investigation. The Crossroads Asia network itself is a good example for this. Another one is the network Phantom Borders in Eastern Central Europe. Support is also being provided for collaborations between cases, smaller fringe subjects are being intelligently integrated. Moreover, the support has led to a huge increase in awareness of area studies research within universities and among experts in the relevant fields, and has provided clear structural impetus. And this is also having an international impact. In the language of economics, we have acted anti-cyclically. While area studies have been the subject of cuts in many countries and their academic and research systems, the German research ministry, the BMBF, has strengthened and raised the status of this field in the last years. By 2017, around 50 million euros of funding will have gone towards area study projects. There is a further aspect which definitely belongs in this positive review of the funding initiative. We, the Federal Research Ministry, and our project management agency have found the cooperation with the research projects to be very pleasant and constructive, really in all of the cases. I would therefore like to express my sincere thanks to all those of you who have taken part in this project.
Thank you very much. We've got about 50 minutes for a discussion, and I suggest we structure the discussion into two parts. In a first brief round, I would allow questions that respond directly to the panelists, and then in the second part, we will open the discussion to whatever you would like to say. So I would collect questions relating directly to what we've just heard from the panelists. Okay, so from step one, we step right away to step two and open the discussion to whatever you would like to say, whether it concerns the panelists or not. Yes, please.
Yeah, there is one question that bothers me, although it's not really clear how to answer it, and it is perhaps even unfair to address it to the ministry, which has so generously been funding us. Yet somewhere, looking at it from a, how to say, observing or analyzing perspective, I feel as a political scientist there is some sort of a structural or strategic contradiction between the fact that we are spending money on promoting the area studies, and yet there seem to be no sufficient strategic incentives for the universities and the system to do it anyway in the first place as a result of growing global significance, interaction. It seems to some extent unreal and absurd that we need to convince people that this is actually the time that we need competence in other languages and cultures. So maybe it is also to do with the federation system and a system of incentives, but maybe there is an opportunity to fine-tune one or the other incentive system.
Yes, Eilers, you would like to respond?
Yeah. I see your point. Part of the problem is the federal system in Germany. We only can finance projects up to a certain duration. The duration of these area study projects is rather long, with up to 6 years. And this is our means to promote their organizational and conceptual significance in a way. In some places, area studies or area studies expertise is mentioned prominently in university development plans and profiles. For example, inclusion of Latin America in the Freie Universität Berlin's application under the Excellence Initiative. The importance given to the Global South theme in the Excellence Initiative application of the University of Cologne, prioritization of research covering China and Asia in Freiburg, the successful bid for the Graduate School for East and Southeast European Studies at LMU München. Those are some effects we have already earned. The question is, could we do more? It's a problem of federalism in my mind. We only can try to fund interesting developments and give you the means to convince. But the institutional anchor must be in the federal system, within the universities and within the Länder. So I'm confident seeing these examples that there are some more, and the effects are there, and this field is convincing enough to establish itself with our help in the universities. But we are a minor player in this part, considering institutional funding.
Thank you. Could the discussants kindly say their names when they ask a question? So the next question was over there, next to the camera.
Thank you very much. My name is Claudia Eilers from the Center for Global Cooperation Research in Duisburg and the University of Marburg. Thanks also to the panel for concisely summarizing the fruits of several years now of initiatives to enhance area studies. Having been kind of an observer of the way this initiative went and developed, and being, of course, into area studies and disciplines myself, I have the feeling by now that we have come to a point where the dialogue between the so-called systematic disciplines, and I'm coming from one, political science, and the area studies has really developed in a very engaged and fruitful way. But on the other hand, and this is maybe another pillar of my own biography, being into Middle Eastern studies and East Asian and Southeast Asian studies, or Asian and Middle Eastern studies, I still have the feeling that the dialogue between landscapes of area studies could be enhanced more. There are still particular cultures of area studies that very much pertain to the delineations that we find and that are sustained. We have begun here in this conference to try to attempt to bring them together, but I still do not have the feeling that there is an engagement between African, Central Asian, Middle Eastern, East Asian, Southeast Asian studies that would bring us to a situation that we find already in the dialogue between area studies and disciplines. And I would very much like to maybe hear some ideas on that, because I know on the panel there are several people who are maybe not into different areas, but who have a sense of what it means to work in different and with different world regions or areas, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Or does anybody want to respond to what we just heard? Beyond or between area studies? Yes, please.
I'm from the University of Copenhagen, and it's very encouraging to see the steps that are being taken in Germany to promote or revitalize area studies, while we seem to be suffering the opposite fate in Denmark. I just have two questions, and it's directed to anyone who would like to answer this. And one is, what are the measurements or the markers of success of this funding and the revitalization of area studies? What do you see as outcomes that would spell success in the long term? The second question is that it seems that the biggest challenge that you face right now is, how do you convince the universities themselves to make this a sustainable thing, and what steps are being taken to address that biggest challenge now? Because we see that at the federal side you are giving the encouragement, and we can see at the local institutional levels, a lot is being done, but it seems that the in-between, at the rector's office, that's where the biggest challenge now lies, and what steps are being taken in that level.
Yes, Peter Jackson.
Maybe I just put in Sabine. You articulated something which, from afar, I had perceived. You used the word countercyclical. That the German funding for area studies was countercyclical to what's happening in the rest of the world in many other places, and I think Cynthia was reflecting on that. I was just wondering, in terms of a policy, back in 2009 when the Excellence Initiative and particularly the area studies focus was determined, was that a self-conscious element at the policy level within the ministry to actually take a countercyclical approach to funding of area studies, given what was happening in North America and other parts of the world?
I'll answer directly. It was a conscious decision to do something anti-cyclically, but in a bit broader context. This was an initiative for the humanities, and it stood under the philosophy freedom for thinking, freedom for the humanities, and it coincided with this recommendation from the Wissenschaftsrat in the field of area studies, and so we thought what a good idea to do humanities in this field.
So Anna, and then
Anastasia.
Anastasia, okay.
Thank you for the very interesting statements. I have two very practical, straightforward questions, basically. One is that, I mean, the federal system has been mentioned quite a lot, and we are aware of the challenges that arise from there, also for our own work. What I always wonder, and would be interested in your reply, Ms. Eilers, is this aspect that, I mean, out of my perspective, isn't there must be some kind of link between the federal ministry and the state ministries, and I wonder, I mean, there should be a very strong interest on state level as well, that when federal funds have been spent, that there's a sustainability afterwards created. So my question would be, what is BMBF? Is BMBF taking some steps, facilitating a negotiation process there between the two levels, federal and state level? And then linked to that, the question, and that's basically my second question, is then the question, what can we do? And you've mentioned the Wissenschaftsrat several times. Well, are there similar initiatives right now that you, I mean, we might be aware of it, we might not be aware of it, that you would say, well, engage here, there is a platform where you can voice your concerns, your interests, etc. For maybe offering also support for negotiations between federal level and state level. You might say, well, that's naive, but maybe there is a way of doing this. And also for quite explicitly maybe assisting in or offering a basis for shaping further funding lines and further calls.
Okay. Of course, there is a platform for collaboration between the federal and the states and the Bund. That's the gemeinsame Wissenschaftskonferenz of Bund and the Länder. And they do joint funding, for example, for research institutions like Max Planck Institute or Helmholtz Institute, something like that. But they also do joint funding at the Excellence Initiative or those really big initiatives. That's the only way for organized collaboration with joint funding we right now have. There are some things changing. We are having some changes in the in the laws ongoing, but we will see how this works out. In my opinion, the best way would be to keep it in mind, because the negotiation, what will follow Excellence Initiative and those things, are starting just now. And the Science Council, the Wissenschaftsrat, has taken up the future of the science system as a theme too. Those are all ongoing discussions, mostly beginning just now, because there are still 2 years' time to conclude them, and because other things were more urgent just now, like the follow-up to the Pact for Innovation, for example. It's really high level to get there, but it can be part of the negotiations going to start on your level. I think we support you doing conferences, doing publicity for what you do. And it's always our aim to reach the states and the university heads too.
Okay, thank you. Anastasia?
Yes, thank you. Anastasia Christou from Middlesex University, London, UK. And I wanted to thank the panel for the insightful and very honest, reflective commentary on some of the issues that we're commonly experiencing. And in the UK, in the context of austerity measures and budget cuts in universities, we just had a glimpse of light with the announcement of the Open Worlds Research Initiative by our Arts and Humanities Research Council, with some prospects of research in the humanities and social sciences. But I wanted to, without undermining the global initiatives of area studies and your programs and projects, I wanted to, in a sense, ground you to the European project and the European level. And I'm interested in that translocal, transregional commitment or vision or initiative or contribution that Germany, as a pedagogic actor, has in mind or will be contributing in terms of research networks of excellence and learning and teaching on a European level, in terms of utilizing these initiatives for local projects of democratization and social justice and pedagogic excellence and social and cultural development. So I'm wondering if you have any views on the position that Germany will take or is taking in relation to the European context.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Does anybody want to respond to that? Yeah. No?
It's not that difficult. I mean, we have to recognize that in Horizon 2020, the budget for the humanities and social sciences was reduced to 50%. That's number one. Number two, that those I would call methodological nationalists were successful in putting certain themes on the agenda, Europe in its enlargement, etc. I remember the discussions we had on the German contribution to that formulation, and it was very clear that social scientists who had this idea of society being a container were successful to influence the formulation of what is now the program in humanities and social sciences. Of course, the good news about Europe is that the ERC is a very open organization, and that calls, although they are not bound by these strange formulations. Insofar, I'm happy that the thematic program is reduced in its budget, while I would criticize that in comparison to the natural sciences and life sciences. It's a question to the government if there is any initiative, but what I hear in Brussels when I'm there is we are now on track till 2020 forget about making new ideas, new proposals, this time is over. We think now about 2017, because the calls for 15 and 16 are more or less formulated, so it's very difficult to address this. Another thing is that they have turned down practically Erasmus Mundus, which was one of the tools to involve non-European partners into European educational or higher educational initiatives. And now there is this new mechanism of Erasmus Plus. We just learn how to make use of it. So I just got this morning a nice Excel sheet from my university. This is what the national representative, BAD, will communicate to Brussels as the share Germany would like to have. And now you can compete about, was it 2 South Africans incoming and 10 whatever. So we have just to learn. I can tell you in 2 years' time if Erasmus Plus is working or not. But right now there is no mechanism. All actors are more or less helpless to predict what will happen with this new instrument. If you would allow, I would address 2 other questions. One is this inter-area studies communication. I mean, we just started with CrossArea, this initiative, and I hope that in the first half of the next year we will have the conference in Berlin. Vincent will eventually talk more about bringing us together in discussing how to apply Bologna rules to the area studies traditions, or the other way around. You will make that much better. When it comes to criteria of funding, this is funny. When you are in a position as head of such a center, you negotiate with the rectorate and they say millions, publications, PhDs. Yeah, this is what they can count. And then you come back to your center and they say, we are not interested at all in these figures because we will contribute to such a center only when there is interesting discussion. So either you call it transregional, interdisciplinary, or whatsoever, no one would contribute to these nice balances in figures you have to report uphill when you have nothing to offer intellectually to the people on the ground. So I guess this is what we have to manage, and as I know, Copenhagen is more or less the same there. Some call it the neoliberalization of a university, but I don't believe that much that this is only, or I believe that this is only one part of the coin. We wouldn't get anything off from the ground when it would be only with a cynical statement, let's earn some third stream money, or let's fulfill plans. I mean, even the socialist or Stalinist tradition, you wouldn't accept that as an intrinsic motivation. If I can add one point more to what the ministry could do, I mean, I'm really angry about how we are hidden in statistics. And there's a very fundamental point that is a classification of the knowledge order. Area studies are hidden in Sprach- und Kulturwissenschaften, which is a very, very large area and is completely overshadowed by the big disciplines training future high school teachers. Yeah, German studies, French studies, English studies, etc., etc. And that makes it so difficult for all authorities to identify if something happens in area studies. So either if there is success or complete catastrophe in front of the door. Everyone was talking during this initiative about the high number of people we train towards PhD and even habilitation. And there was great fear that there will be too many candidates for the very few positions in the universities. But unfortunately, no one can say something concrete about that because the statistics hide that completely. So all I learned is that we have some 5,000 professors in Sprach- und Kulturwissenschaften. And you may remember from the preparation of 2006 report how difficult it was to get an overview of what area studies in Germany mean. At that time, these statistics were wrong, but now they are completely outdated. So the question is, how to get a precise overview. We all talk about our universities, about what we can see, yeah? But to make policy on the basis of such vague information is a rather risky strategy, seems to me.
So I take the privilege of being in control of the microphone and ask one or two questions myself. The first one comes from my own empirical research experience in Africa. I don't know whether that is different in Asia, but what I do see is that the working conditions of my colleagues from the United Kingdom or for France are quite different as compared to mine, which has something to do with the way how research is organized on our side in Germany. We have DAID offices in Nairobi and in other places. Volkswagen is doing a lot of things and DFG is not present in the area. There are a number of German universities which have their own liaison offices, which is, I think that's a complete nonsense, something I never understood why they're spending money on that. And compared to Britain and to France, they have their national research centers, something which I find very useful for the nationals of those countries. Now, I do not argue for establishing German research centers all over the world, but my question would be, and this links up to what Anastasia said, why can't we have something like that on a European level? So a coordinated organization of research offices as a representation of European research in the countries where we're working. I asked that questions to colleagues of yours from the ministry, and the answer was, well, we are not responsible for that. The people in the Foreign Office said, well, this research is not our business. The Development Ministry, they said, well, we are supporting development, but not science cooperation. So who, if any, could do that, if not your ministry? Take the initiative and try to organize something in that direction. Take it as a rhetorical question. I would also have a provocative question in the direction of Matthias Middell. Since you come from Leipzig, and if I got you right, one critique about area studies is, you said it's hidden somewhere in the statistics, and quite often representatives of the area studies, they are members of the orchard discipline, so some small fragments hidden in the university. I remember in Leipzig it was quite different until 1990. Leipzig was one of the centers of the area studies in GDR for Middle East and Oriental studies. The section of, at that time was called a section, of Middle East studies in Leipzig were something like 35 scientists. The other one was in Rostock. I think they did Latin American studies, and Berlin was African studies. So they had only 3 centers of area studies. My provocative question is it that what you want? A concentration process?
No, not yes, but in a completely different sense. When you go a little bit back in history, then there was in 1965 in Leipzig an attempt to create a center for Africa, Asian and Latin American studies. And this became dangerous during the time of the third reform of the higher education system in GDR, simply because there was too much expertise on different ways to transform society. And that is the reason why in '68 it was decided to dissolve that complex into 3 different things, Africa and Middle East and Leipzig, Asia and Berlin, and Latin America and Rostock. Fortunately, the GDR was completely inefficient to execute this because they had not to offer any apartment in Berlin or Rostock to the researchers, therefore some people remained there. So I would of course say yes, you have to concentrate, at least at some places, area studies in a wider sense, not for one area only, where you have critical mass. And it can be regional, it has not to be local, but it can be regional, where you have the chance to cooperate. But I don't see really a sense to be as provocative as your question was. I don't see any sense in having in each and every university 1 or 2 professorships and to run their programs. This is not what students normally should get. This, you know, one Welterklärer as your professor. But you can see that in a completely different way. I know that people defend, of course, their turfs.
I think we should take there into account the different contexts at the universities, because I don't see that there are universities either which have a big center and established area studies, or some localized personal hobbies who work on their specific area. For example, the situation at our university was that we had from several disciplines people working on the Americas. We established a master studies program, but still the program is invisible within the university in an institutional way. So it's related to the faculties. The center exists as a center based on 2 faculties, and there is no visibility, no extra counting of the funding that we have, which is with the 2 projects quite a lot. It is recognized towards the funding of the faculties. The same with the studies we have. We have students in our master degree of Inter-American Studies that are now annually comparable with the students in history of the Fachwissenschaftlichen Master. So I think it's very important to take into account the different contexts at the university, and to leave space that something new can emerge from different constellations. And because area studies are changing, we are now changing debate on area studies, and that this does not mean that we only have to put focus on the old established centers, but also to leave this kind of space open.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have the impression that the discussion is coming to an end. Thank you very much.